She spent entire nights alone. But what she found at her door changed her life. Margaret Sullivan stood at her kitchen window at 2 in the morning, watching rain streak the glass like tears she refused to shed. The house in Savannah, Georgia felt cavernous now. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a dining room that hadn't hosted a family dinner in over a year. The silence had become her constant, unwelcome companion since the divorce papers were signed, and her children scattered across the country for college and careers. At 54, Margaret had thought she'd mastered the art of solitude. After 32 years of marriage, she'd learned to change light bulbs, unclog drains, program the coffee maker, and eat dinner alone without crying, most nights anyway. She'd built walls of routine and dignity, convincing herself that independence was a choice, rather than a circumstance thrust upon her by a husband who decided their empty nest was the perfect time to find himself with his 28-year-old dental hygienist. The sound that pierced the November night wasn't just a meow. It cut through the quiet like someone tapping on the window of her heart. Outside on the damp porch, the humid air carried the scent of salt marsh and trampled grass. There, huddled next to a cracked plastic bowl that looked like it had seen better decades, a slate-gray cat stared at her with amber eyes so steady and knowing that she almost stepped back from the window. Margaret had always prided herself on rational decision-making. She was the woman who balanced checkbooks, scheduled maintenance appointments, and kept emergency kits stocked with batteries and bottled water. She was not the woman who made impulsive decisions about stray animals at 2 in the morning during a thunderstorm, but something about those amber eyes made her hand reach for the door handle anyway. "What are you doing out here in this weather?" she whispered, crouching down despite the rain soaking through her robe. The cat didn't flinch, didn't run. Instead, it tilted its head as if considering her question with the gravity it deserved, then took a tentative step closer. Up close, she could see he was thin but not emaciated, wet but not bedraggled. His grey coat had silver undertones that caught the porch light, and those remarkable amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. No collar, no obvious injuries, but something in his posture suggested he'd been someone's beloved pet before the world had gone sideways. The wind whipped through the corridor between houses, carrying dust and memories she'd tried to keep locked away since her world fell apart. Her ex-husband had taken half their friends in the divorce, all their couple's traditions, and their shared future. Her children called dutifully every Sunday, but lived lives too full and bright to include her daily reality of reading the same book 3 times because she couldn't concentrate, of cooking for one and throwing away half the food, of having entire conversations with the television news anchors. Pride and silence, that had been her survival strategy for the past 18 months. But now, looking at this small creature who seemed to have nowhere else to go, something cracked in the fortress she'd built around her heart. "Come inside," she said, opening the door wider. "Just for tonight. We'll figure out what to do with you in the morning." Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. The cat walked in without hesitation, as if he knew that some doors need to be opened by someone from the outside. He surveyed the living room with the confidence of a landlord inspecting property, taking in the overstuffed furniture, the family photos Margaret hadn't had the courage to take down, the stack of unread books on the coffee table. Then he settled on the braided rug by the entrance, positioning himself like a sentinel guarding the threshold between Margaret's old life and whatever came next. That same night, toweling him dry with one of her good bath towels, Margaret gave him a name. Not Smokey or Grey or Shadow, something that would stick in her mind, something strong and unmistakably American, something that sounded like it belonged in a house with substance and history. "Ashford," she said aloud, testing how it felt on her tongue. The cat looked up at her with those remarkable eyes and began to purr. Margaret expected him to curl up in the makeshift bed she'd prepared from old towels in the laundry room. Instead, Ashford chose the doormat in the front hall, as if his job was to watch over entrances and exits, to guard against loneliness trying to sneak back in through the cracks. She offered him a can of tuna, the only pet-appropriate food in her pantry, but he turned his nose up at it. When she boiled plain chicken breast in water, however, he devoured every shred with the enthusiasm of someone who recognized real cooking when he tasted it. The house, which had smelled like old newspapers and forgotten coffee for months, suddenly carried the aroma of something prepared with intention, with someone waiting. It had been so long since Margaret had cooked for a living creature that she'd forgotten the simple satisfaction of watching someone enjoy her food, even if that someone was a cat who'd appeared from nowhere on a stormy night. It felt like the first crack in the wall of pride she'd built around herself, the first suggestion that maybe, just maybe, she was still capable of caring for something beyond her own survival. Ashford observed her from strategic corners throughout the evening, head slightly tilted, like someone taking careful mental notes. When she tried to close herself in the bedroom for the night, he sat outside the door and meowed with such persistent authority that she finally gave up and left it ajar. During the tears that came without warning while she was brushing her teeth, triggered by nothing more than the sight of a single toothbrush in the holder where two had lived for 3 decades, Ashford appeared in the bathroom doorway, climbed into her lap when she sank to the floor and stayed there, warm and heavy and purring, until her breathing calmed and the wave of grief passed. For the first time in months, Margaret fell asleep feeling responsible for something that mattered, something that needed her to wake up the next morning and figure out what came next. When she opened her eyes at dawn, Ashford was sitting on the windowsill, silhouetted against the grey sky, watching the world wake up. He turned to look at her when he heard her stir, and in that moment, Margaret realized she was no longer alone in the house. More importantly, she realized she didn't want to be. The question now was what to do about it, and whether she had the courage to make another decision that might change everything all over again. The Savannah Community Animal Hospital occupied a converted Victorian house on Bull Street, painted cheerful yellow with white trim and surrounded by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Margaret had driven past it countless times during her marriage, but never imagined she'd be walking through its doors, carrying a cat carrier with a mysterious passenger inside. Dr. Patricia Chen was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of efficient, gentle hands that put both animals and their humans at ease immediately. She examined Ashford with thorough professionalism, while he submitted to the process with remarkable dignity, only occasionally shooting Margaret looks that seemed to say, "I hope you know what you're doing." "He's about 3 years old, healthy weight, well socialized," Dr. Chen announced, checking his teeth and running practiced hands along his limbs. "Someone definitely cared for him. He's been neutered, and his coat condition suggests he's been eating regularly. This isn't a feral cat. This is someone's pet who's found himself without a home." The realistic explanation for his appearance at her door, animals displaced by extreme weather and rushed tenant changes, rental agreements that didn't allow pets, military deployments, job losses, family crises, didn't diminish the fact that at her specific address, on her particular porch, he had chosen to stay. Savannah had hundreds of porches, thousands of potential refugees, but he'd picked hers. "What are my options?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew the answer in her heart. She'd been asking herself the same question all morning, during the careful process of coaxing Ashford into the borrowed carrier, during the drive through the historic district, with its elegant mansions and tourist crowds, during the wait in the reception area, surrounded by pet owners who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Dr. Chen sat back in her chair, studying Margaret's face as she stroked Ashford's head, where he sat calmly on the examination table. "Well, you could surrender him to the municipal shelter, but I have to tell you honestly, they're at capacity. After Hurricane Debbie and the flooding last month, we've seen a huge influx of displaced animals. Good cats like this one. They might find homes, but it could take months, and the shelter environment is stressful." Margaret felt something twist in her chest at the thought of Ashford in a cage, waiting for strangers to decide his fate. "Or," Dr. Chen continued, "you could foster him while we post found pet notices and check with other local shelters. Give it 30 days. See if anyone claims him, see how it goes for both of you." The weight of the decision settled on Margaret's shoulders like a familiar coat. She hadn't made a choice this important since she'd signed the divorce papers, hadn't committed to anything beyond weekly grocery shopping and monthly hair appointments. The safe thing would be to surrender him and walk away, to preserve the careful equilibrium she'd built around her solitude. But when she looked at Ashford, sitting there with such trust and patience, she thought about the way he'd settled on her doormat like he belonged there, the way he'd made her cook again, the way he'd sat with her through last night's tears without judgment or advice, or the kind of platitudes well-meaning friends had been offering for months. 30 days, she heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. I can do 30 days. Doctor, Chen smiled, the first genuine smile Margaret had received from a stranger in longer than she could remember. Let's get his vaccinations up to date and talk about what you'll need. Walking out of the clinic with a bag full of supplies and a newly microchipped cat who now legally belonged to her for the next month, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility and possibility in equal measure. Ashford rode calmly in the carrier, occasionally pressing his paw against the mesh window, as if pointing out landmarks during their journey home. She found herself talking to him during the drive, about the neighborhood, about the weather, about the strange turn her life had taken in less than 24 hours. You know, Ashford, I haven't made a decision this big in over a year. My whole life used to be about making decisions. What to cook for dinner, where to go on vacation, which schools were best for the kids, whether to refinance the mortgage. Now look at me, talking to a cat I've known for one day about whether we're compatible roommates. But when she caught sight of his steady amber gaze in the rearview mirror, she didn't feel foolish. She felt heard, understood in a way that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with presence. The Homeowners Association letter was waiting in her mailbox when they got home. Crisp white envelope with the Forest Hills subdivision logo in the corner. Margaret's heart sank as she read the contents. Pet registration required within 72 hours. Window screens mandatory for all units housing cats. Security deposit due within 10 business days. Fines for property damage caused by unregistered pets. She had avoided HOA meetings since the divorce, unwilling to face the neighbors who'd witnessed her marriage's public unraveling at the community 4th of July barbecue when Tom had shown up with Brittany and pretended it was perfectly normal. The thought of walking into that community center, standing up in front of Sandra Walsh and the rest of the board, admitting she had a cat now, felt almost as daunting as signing the foster papers. But Ashford needed those screens. More than that, if she was going to be responsible for him, she needed to be responsible properly, legally, completely. So for the first time in 18 months, Margaret Sullivan put on her good slacks and a clean sweater and attended the monthly HOA meeting in the beige community center that smelled like folding chairs and burnt coffee and the accumulated anxiety of suburban democracy in action. The meeting room was half full, maybe 20 people scattered across rows of metal chairs, most of them checking their phones or reviewing printed agendas with the resigned patience of people fulfilling civic duty. Sandra Walsh, the association president, managed neighborhood drama with the efficiency of an air traffic controller, moving through budget reports and landscaping updates with crisp authority. New business, Sandra announced, consulting her clipboard. Pet registrations and compliance issues. Margaret's hands started sweating. She hadn't spoken in public since her last parent-teacher conference, back when she still signed permission slips and packed lunchboxes and had a legitimate reason to attend school board meetings. Her voice felt rusty from disuse, uncertain in a way that would have surprised anyone who'd known her during her teaching years. Margaret Sullivan, 42 Magnolia Lane, she said, when Sandra called for new registrations, standing on legs that felt less steady than they should. I'm fostering a cat. Found him on my porch during the storm 3 days ago. The room's attention felt like stage lights, bright and exposing. Margaret could see her next-door neighbor Miriam Locke in the third row, giving her an encouraging nod. Tom Henderson from the end of the street was there with his wife Joyce, both of them offering polite smiles that didn't quite hide their curiosity about the Sullivan woman who'd become something of a neighborhood mystery since her husband left. Breed and age? Sandra asked, pen poised over her form. Mixed breed, about 3 years old, grey, very well behaved. Name? Ashford. Registration fee is $50 plus a $100 security deposit for potential damages. Screen installation is your responsibility and must be completed within 14 days of registration. Margaret wrote the check with hands that only trembled slightly, aware that she was committing to expenses she hadn't budgeted for, changes to her house she hadn't planned, a level of community engagement she'd been avoiding. But as she handed over the paperwork, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of taking care of something important, of being responsible for more than just her own daily survival. After the meeting, in the parking lot under the amber glow of streetlights, a teenager approached her with the kind of earnest politeness that suggested good parenting and honor roll grades. Miss Sullivan, I'm Callum Wade. I live over on Azalea Court. I heard you need screens installed. He was maybe 16, with blue eyes and sandy hair that needed cutting. wearing a Savannah High School letter jacket over khakis that had been pressed with military precision. "I'm working on community service hours for National Honor Society. Could do the installation for free if you provide materials and maybe write me a reference letter when I'm done." Margaret studied the boy's face, seeing something of her own son's in his eager expression. In another life, David or Michael might have made similar offers to neighbors before they'd grown up and moved away to build their own lives in distant cities, too busy for more than weekly phone calls and obligatory holiday visits. "When can you start?" she asked. "Tomorrow after school. I've got all my own tools and my dad taught me how to measure properly. I promise I'll do it right." Walking back to her car, Margaret felt the weight of the evening's decisions. She'd committed to keeping Ashford for at least a month. She'd paid fees she couldn't easily afford. She'd spoken up in public for the first time since her world fell apart. She'd agreed to let a stranger's teenager into her house to do work she could have hired professionals to complete. 6 months ago, any one of these choices would have required consultation with Tom, discussion of budgets and risks and social implications. Tonight, she'd made them all herself, based on nothing more complicated than a cat's amber eyes and her own growing certainty that isolation wasn't the same thing as independence. Driving home through the quiet streets of her subdivision, Margaret caught herself looking forward to walking through her front door, to seeing Ashford's reaction to her return, to telling him about her evening and the plans they'd made for their shared future. It occurred to her that she was no longer living alone. More surprisingly, she was no longer living just for herself. Callum Wade arrived that Saturday morning with a toolbox that had clearly been assembled with love and attention, each tool in its designated place, wrapped in cloth to prevent scratching. He also carried a notebook where he'd sketched rough measurements of Margaret's windows based on his observations from the sidewalk, demonstrating the kind of methodical preparation that reminded her of her better students from her teaching days. Ashford immediately appointed himself supervisor of the operation, following Callum from room to room with the focused attention of a quality control inspector. He positioned himself precisely where he could observe the work without interfering, sitting like a grey statue while Callum measured window frames and tested screen tensions. "He's got opinions about everything, doesn't he?" Callum observed, holding his measuring tape steady while Ashford watched from the kitchen windowsill, tail twitching at the sight of cardinals feeding in the backyard. "He's very particular about how things should be done," Margaret agreed, surprising herself by smiling. It had been so long since she'd had reason to make casual conversation that she'd forgotten how pleasant it could be. "Would you like some coffee? I made extra." "Yes, ma'am, thank you. My mum always says good work starts with good coffee." They settled into an easy rhythm, Callum working with the concentrated focus of someone who'd watched too many YouTube tutorials but had the intelligence to apply the principles correctly, while Margaret found herself explaining proper measurements, pointing out electrical outlets to avoid, offering advice about weatherproofing that she didn't realize she still remembered from decades of managing home improvement projects. "You were a teacher," Callum said suddenly, pausing in his installation of the living room screen. It wasn't a question. Margaret stopped mid-sentence, holding a screen frame steady while he secured the corners. "How did you know?" "The way you explained things. You break it down into steps that make sense, and you don't get frustrated when I ask questions." "My mum's a teacher too. Same voice, same patience." The observation hit Margaret in an unexpected place. She'd taken early retirement when the county made budget cuts, eliminating her position along with several others in a cost-saving measure that had felt more like amputation than downsizing. For 31 years she'd been Mrs. Sullivan, who taught American history to sophomores, who chaperoned school dances and coached academic quiz bowl teams, and spent summers developing curriculum that would make the Revolutionary War feel relevant to teenagers born in the digital age. "I taught high school," she heard herself say. "American history, retired last year. Bet you were good at it. You've got the gift." The weight of being recognized as a teacher, of having her professional identity acknowledged by someone who'd never sat in her classroom, settled on Margaret's shoulders with the comfort of an old coat. For months, she'd been nobody in particular. Not a wife, not a mother actively parenting, not a teacher shaping young minds. Just a woman living alone in a house too big for her circumstances. But here was this earnest teenager, treating her like someone whose knowledge mattered, whose guidance had value. When he struggled with a particularly stubborn screen corner, she showed him how to apply pressure at just the right angle. When he worried about making the screens too tight, She explained the importance of allowing for expansion and contraction with weather changes. "My mum would love to meet you," Callum said during their lunch break, eating the sandwich Margaret had insisted on making for him. She teaches 3rd grade at Marshpoint Elementary, always complains about how the high school teachers get all the glory when it comes to academic achievement, but she loves hearing stories from the upper grades. The casual invitation to adult friendship, offered through the innocent social networking of a 16-year-old, felt both terrifying and appealing. Margaret hadn't made a new friend since college, had spent her entire adult life socialized through her children's activities and her husband's professional connections. The idea of meeting someone based purely on shared professional experience seemed revolutionary. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. Saturday's farmers market in Forsyth Park had become one of Margaret's few regular social activities, a weekly expedition that forced her out of the house and into the mild chaos of community commerce. The market sprawled across the park's southern end, white tents and colorful awnings housing everything from organic produce to handmade soaps to the kind of artisanal coffee that cost more than Margaret thought reasonable but tasted like civilization itself. She made her usual rounds: tomatoes from the Hendricks farm booth, fresh bread from the German bakery stand, local honey that the vendor swore would help with seasonal allergies, but today she paused at a booth she'd previously walked past, without much interest. The Coastal Animal Rescue had set up a table with donation jars, adoption flyers, and a volunteer who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else but was committed to doing her civic duty. "Excuse me," Margaret said, approaching the table with Ashford's registration papers in her purse and questions she hadn't known she needed to ask. "I recently took in a stray cat. I'm trying to understand how common that is right now." The volunteer, a woman in her 60s with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent her life caring for animals, looked up with immediate interest. "Oh, honey, you have no idea how common it is. After Hurricane Debbie and that cold snap we had in October, we've been overwhelmed. People evacuate and can't take their pets, or they're staying in temporary housing that doesn't allow animals, or they just can't afford veterinary care anymore." She gestured to a poster board covered with photographs of cats and dogs in various states of need. "These are just the ones from the last month. Beautiful animals, most of them. Well socialized, house-trained, clearly somebody's beloved pets before life got complicated." Margaret studied the photos, seeing animals with the same intelligent eyes, the same air of patient dignity that characterized Ashford. This eliminated any romantic notion of miraculous coincidence and established a practical reality. Her cat was a product of American economic pressures and housing instability, not divine intervention or fairy tale magic. Still, the way Ashford had guided her to the kitchen window that very morning, positioning himself in the sunlight until she'd followed his gaze and realized she needed to open the curtains and let the day in, felt like domestic magic of a very real and powerful kind. "Are you looking to adopt, or did you find one that needs help?" the volunteer asked. "Found one. 3 days ago, during that thunderstorm. I'm fostering him for now, trying to see if anyone's looking for him." Smart approach. "What does he look like?" Margaret described Ashford in detail: his slate-grey coat with silver highlights, his remarkable amber eyes, his confident but gentle demeanor. The volunteer made notes, promised to check their database of missing pets, and handed Margaret a stack of flyers. "Post these at the library, the grocery stores, anywhere people gather. Social media too if you do that. But I'll tell you honestly, after 3 days with no one looking and given what he sounds like, someone either couldn't keep him anymore or chose not to look. Either way, you're probably his best hope now." Walking home with her market purchases and a growing sense of responsibility, Margaret realized that the 30-day foster period Dr. Chen had suggested wasn't really about finding Ashford's original family. It was about Margaret finding the courage to admit she wanted him to stay, and Ashford deciding whether her household met his standards for permanent residence. That evening, she posted photos on Nextdoor and printed flyers for the library bulletin board. "Found cat, slate grey with amber eyes, very friendly, no collar. Found November 15th near Forest Hills subdivision." She included her phone number and a photo that captured Ashford's dignified expression perfectly. 3 days passed. No phone calls, no emails, no desperate pet owners knocking on her door. The silence felt both disappointing and relieving, closing one chapter of uncertainty while opening another, filled with different kinds of questions about commitment, responsibility, and the courage required to build a life around caring for something fragile and irreplaceable. On Tuesday evening, her phone rang. Margaret's heart jumped, expecting someone to claim Ashford and dissolve the strange new reality she'd been constructing around his presence. Instead, it was her daughter Sarah calling from Portland, her voice carrying the particular tone children use when they're preparing to offer parental advice to their parents. "Mum, Callum Wade's mother called me. Apparently you hired her son to do work at the house." Margaret felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, the old habit of seeking permission for decisions she was perfectly capable of making herself. "He's installing window screens for the cat." "Mum, are you sure about this? A pet is a huge commitment. You've never had a cat before. What if you're allergic? What if he destroys the furniture? What if—" "Sarah," Margaret surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "I'm 54 years old. I managed a household and raised 3 children and taught teenagers for 31 years. I think I can handle one cat." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Margaret to worry she'd been too sharp, too defensive. Then Sarah laughed, not mockingly, but with what sounded like relief. "You're right, I'm sorry. It's just, you've seemed so sad since Dad left, so isolated. I guess I worry about you making big changes when you're still adjusting to everything else." Margaret looked across the living room to where Ashford was conducting his evening grooming routine with typical feline precision, one leg extended at an angle that seemed to defy basic anatomy. The sight of him, so confidently at home in her space, filled her with a calm certainty she hadn't felt about anything in months. "I think this change is exactly what I needed, honey. He's good company, and he's making me do things I wouldn't do otherwise: meet neighbors, talk to people, take care of something beyond just myself." "Well, when you put it that way, maybe I could meet him when I visit for Christmas?" After hanging up, Margaret realized it was the first time she'd defended a major decision to one of her children without immediately second-guessing herself. The independence felt both terrifying and exhilarating, like learning to drive a stick shift or speak a foreign language, difficult but essential skills for navigating the life she was building. Ashford looked up from his grooming, caught her watching him, and offered one of his slow, deliberate blinks. In the language of cats she'd learned from her internet research, slow blinks meant trust, maybe even love. Thanksgiving arrived with a power outage that swept through Savannah like a dark tide, taking down ancient oak trees and modern power grids with equal indifference. The storm had been predicted, a late-season cold front colliding with warm Gulf air, but prediction didn't make the reality any less disorienting when the lights went out at 4 in the afternoon and stayed out. Margaret's house, built in the 1970s, had a gas stove, a gas water heater, and the kind of solid construction that had weathered worse storms than this one. She had candles, flashlights, battery-powered radio, and enough canned goods to outlast a minor apocalypse. What she didn't have was experience being alone in the dark, in the kind of profound silence that settles over neighborhoods when every electronic hum and digital chirp goes quiet at once. Ashford seemed entirely unbothered by the power outage, picking his way through the candlelit rooms with the confident navigation of a creature designed for nocturnal adventures. He settled on the sofa beside Margaret while she tried to read by flashlight, offering the kind of steady, warm presence that made the darkness feel cozy rather than threatening. At 7:30, a hesitant knock at the front door interrupted the quiet. Margaret opened it to find Miriam Locke, her neighbor from the right side of the duplex, holding a flashlight and wearing an expression of sheepish vulnerability. "I know we don't really know each other," Miriam said, her words coming in a nervous rush. "But I can see you have light from your gas stove, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I've never really liked being alone in the dark. Too many years living in apartments where strange sounds could mean anything. Would it be terribly presumptuous of me to ask if I could sit with you until the power comes back?" Margaret felt the same words she'd spoken to Ashford 3 weeks earlier rise to her lips with surprising ease. "Come in. I was just heating up some soup, and there's more than enough for 2. They improvised dinner by candlelight, warming canned tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches on Margaret's gas burner, arranging flashlights on the kitchen table like modern torches. The conversation started cautiously. Comments about the storm, speculation about when the power might return, but gradually deepened into the kind of genuine exchange that happens when people are forced to rely on words rather than television or phones for entertainment. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. Miriam, it turned out, was a retired librarian with strong opinions about mystery novels and a weakness for British television shows that she streamed on her laptop during long winter evenings. She'd been divorced for 15 years, had no children, and had spent most of her adult life perfecting the art of solitary contentment until this particular storm had reminded her that even the most self-sufficient people sometimes needed company. "Funny how it takes a blackout to make neighbors," Miriam observed, scratching behind Ashford's ears as he settled in her lap with the boneless relaxation cats achieve when they've decided someone is trustworthy. "Or a cat," Margaret replied, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "3 weeks ago I barely knew your name. Now look at us, sharing soup by candlelight like characters in a 19th century novel." "He chose well," Miriam said, looking down at Ashford, who had begun purring with the deep rumbling satisfaction of a cat who'd successfully orchestrated a social gathering. Animals know things about people that people don't always know about themselves. When the power returned the next morning, announced by the sudden resurrection of digital clocks and coffee makers and the neighborhood's collective sigh of electrical relief, Margaret expected them to retreat into their previous polite distance. Instead, Miriam appeared at her door on Sunday evening with a homemade apple pie and no excuse other than the transparent truth that she'd enjoyed their conversation and hoped they might continue it. They established an informal routine, Sunday evening dinners, shared when Miriam felt like cooking something too elaborate for one person, and Margaret felt like having company that didn't require small talk about the weather or careful navigation around sensitive subjects like divorce or loneliness, or the particular challenges of building a meaningful life in middle age without a partner. January brought another crisis, this one man-made rather than meteorological. The Coastal Animal Rescue sent out an urgent appeal through their email list and social media networks. Donations desperately needed after a winter surge in abandoned pets. The photographs accompanying the request showed animals with the same patient dignity Margaret recognized in Ashford, well-socialized cats and dogs who'd been loved before circumstances made love impossible to sustain. Margaret read the appeal on her laptop, while Ashford supervised from his preferred perch on the back of her desk chair, occasionally reaching out a paw to bat at the cursor when it moved in particularly interesting patterns across the screen. "What do you think?" she asked him, scrolling through images of cats who looked remarkably like him, dogs with eyes that held the same quiet hope she'd learned to recognize. "Should we try to help?" Ashford's response was to jump down from the chair and walk purposefully to the kitchen, where he positioned himself next to his food bowl with the clear expectation that philosophical discussions were all well and good, but practical needs required immediate attention. Margaret fed him, then spent the evening making lists and phone calls, mobilizing resources she hadn't realized she had access to. The church where she'd started attending Sunday services, mostly for the social contact and the excuse to leave the house, had a tradition of community service projects. The library had bulletin boards and email lists for coordinating neighborhood initiatives. Callum Wade, who'd finished her screen installation but stayed in touch with occasional texts about his college application process, had friends who were always looking for volunteer opportunities that would look good on their resumes. Within a week, Margaret had assembled an informal network for collecting pet supplies, organizing donation drives, and coordinating deliveries to the shelter. Ashford became the unofficial mascot of the operation, appearing in photographs she posted on social media with his nose pressed against donation boxes, amber eyes fixed on the camera as if personally endorsing the cause. Each successful collection required small sacrifices that added up to larger changes in how Margaret lived her daily life. She reorganized her budget, delaying the streaming service subscription she'd been considering and skipping restaurant meals she couldn't afford anyway. She opened her house for sorting donated supplies, which meant admitting that strangers would see her space and judge her housekeeping and notice the family photos she still hadn't removed from the mantel. Most challenging, she had to expose herself to the gratitude of people whose situations were more desperate than her own: shelter volunteers who worked 16-hour days for no pay, pet owners who'd had to surrender beloved animals because of job losses or housing crises or medical emergencies that made caring for dependents impossible. "Thank you," said a woman dropping off 3 bags of dog food at Margaret's front porch, her voice thick with the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting losing battles against circumstance. "My landlord gave us 30 days notice, and the new place doesn't allow pets. I had to take Rex to the shelter yesterday, but at least knowing people like you are helping It makes it a little easier." Margaret accepted the woman's gratitude with the same discomfort she'd once felt accepting condolences after her divorce, not sure she deserved recognition for actions that felt more like self-preservation than altruism. Helping animals helped her feel useful. Organizing donation drives gave her days structure and purpose. Meeting people who shared her concerns about pet welfare expanded her social world beyond the narrow boundaries of her subdivision and her carefully managed solitude. But the cost of visibility was vulnerability. People knew where she lived now, knew her phone number, expected her to answer when they called with requests or problems or simple loneliness disguised as questions about pickup times. Her house, which had been a fortress against the world's demands, became a hub of activity that she couldn't always control or predict. When daylight saving time advanced the clocks in March, Margaret missed a routine medical appointment because she'd been coordinating a Saturday morning pickup of donated pet beds and completely lost track of her personal schedule. Sitting in the rescheduled appointment the following week, listening to Dr. Rodriguez explain test results and medication adjustments with the same patience she'd once used to explain homework assignments to distracted teenagers, Margaret realized she'd been taking better care of Ashford than of herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years managing other people's schedules, her children's sports practices and music lessons, her husband's business travel and social obligations, her students' assignment due dates and testing schedules. Now finally responsible only for herself, she'd somehow forgotten to extend the same careful attention to her own needs that she lavished on a cat who couldn't even speak her language. "I need to make some changes," she told Dr. Rodriguez, pulling out her phone to set calendar reminders for future appointments. "I've been distracted lately, by good things, but still distracted." "It happens," the doctor said, making notes in Margaret's file with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd seen every variety of human self-neglect. "The important thing is that you're here now, taking care of what needs attention. Sometimes we have to learn to balance caring for others with caring for ourselves. It's harder than it sounds." Walking home from the medical center, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settle around her shoulders, like a familiar but ill-fitting coat. She'd spent decades caring for other people, children, students, a husband who'd ultimately decided her care wasn't what he wanted, and had somehow never learned the skill of extending that same attention to her own needs. At home, Ashford met her in the hallway with the particular intensity cats reserve for humans who've been away longer than expected. He pressed his forehead against her knee in what she'd learned was his version of a welcome home greeting, then led her purposefully to the kitchen window where the afternoon sun created a golden rectangle on the floor. "You're right," she said, settling into the patch of warmth beside him. "Sometimes the best medicine is just sitting in the sun for a few minutes." Ashford began purring, that deep rumbling sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than his chest, and Margaret felt some of the day's tension dissolve into the simple pleasure of shared warmth and unconditional acceptance. That evening, she reorganized her calendar, setting reminders for medical appointments, scheduling time for grocery shopping and bill paying, creating boundaries around her volunteer work that would preserve space for the mundane but essential tasks of maintaining her own life. It felt like learning to drive all over again, the conscious attention to details that should have been automatic, the careful balance between moving forward and staying safe. Callum finished his community service hours in April and asked for a reference letter for his college applications. Margaret spent an evening crafting a recommendation that detailed his punctuality, his attention to quality, his gentle patience with Ashford during the screen installation process. Writing about his character and potential felt like returning to a familiar professional skill she'd thought she'd lost forever when she retired from teaching. "He's going to do well wherever he ends up," she told Ashford, printing the final version of the letter while he supervised from his desk chair perch. Smart kids usually figure out how to make good choices, even when they're navigating complicated circumstances. The letter represented more than a favor for a hard-working teenager. It was evidence that Margaret still had professional wisdom worth sharing, that her years of experience evaluating young people's potential hadn't become obsolete when she left the classroom. Callum's mother sent a thank you note the following week, along with an invitation for coffee that felt like the beginning of adult friendship, based on shared values rather than geographical proximity or social obligation. Spring brought longer days, warmer evenings, and visitors who knocked without warning. Miriam's Sunday dinners had evolved into book discussions, casual conversations about novels they'd both read, and arguments about British mystery series that stretched long enough to require second cups of tea. The librarian at the Savannah Public Library, learning about Margaret's teaching background during one of her regular visits, offered the community room for a senior reading group that would meet monthly to discuss short stories and essays. Margaret's first impulse was to decline, to preserve the careful balance she'd built between social engagement and protective solitude. But something about the invitation, the assumption that she had knowledge worth sharing, that other people might benefit from her perspective, felt like an invitation to step back into a version of herself she'd thought was permanently retired. "I could try it once," she told the librarian, accepting copies of the first month's selections. "See how it goes." The reading group consisted of 8 people, mostly women in their 60s and 70s, who'd been meeting informally for years, but had never had professional guidance for their discussions. Margaret found herself falling naturally into teaching rhythms, asking questions that deepened conversation, drawing connections between different texts, encouraging quieter members to share their perspectives while gently managing the more domineering voices. "You're good at this," said Eleanor Washington, a retired nurse who'd become the group's unofficial organizer. "We've been stumbling around these discussions for months, but you know how to make us think deeper about what we're reading." Driving home after that first meeting, Margaret felt muscles she'd forgotten she possessed stretching back into usefulness. Her voice carried the authority she'd once used to command classrooms full of restless teenagers, and her mind had engaged with the familiar pleasure of helping other people discover new ways of understanding familiar ideas. Ashford, perched on the windowsill when she arrived home, turned to greet her with what she'd learned to interpret as approval, the slow blink that meant, "You did well today," in the language of cats who paid attention to their humans' emotional states. The seasons had turned completely now. Autumn had brought leaves on the doormat and the scent of change. Winter had brought blackouts and forced intimacy with neighbors. Spring had opened windows and hearts, filling the house with pollen and possibility, and the voices of people who'd gradually become friends rather than acquaintances. But it was the accumulation of small changes, rather than any single dramatic transformation, that had altered the fundamental nature of Margaret's daily existence. She woke each morning with purpose that extended beyond her own survival. She ended each day with the satisfaction of having cared for something beyond herself. Her house had acquired the sounds and smells and rhythms of a life being actively lived, rather than merely endured. The question now was whether she had the courage to make the temporary permanent, to admit that the 30-day foster period had become irrelevant weeks ago, and to sign the papers that would make Ashford legally, officially, forever hers. May arrived in Savannah like an old friend returning from a long journey, familiar but somehow transformed, carrying the promise of summer in its warm evenings and the urgent green of new growth. Margaret stood in her kitchen on a Saturday morning, coffee cup in hand, watching Ashford conduct his morning patrol of the backyard through the screened windows Callum had installed with such care months earlier. The house felt different now, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly when the transformation had occurred. The silence was no longer empty but expectant, filled with the possibility of phone calls from the shelter about donation pickups, or Miriam stopping by with leftover casserole, or Callum texting about his college acceptance letters. The spaces that had once felt too large for one person now seemed perfectly sized for a life that included both solitude and connection in careful balance. Dr. Chen had called the previous week with a routine reminder about Ashford's vaccinations, and the conversation had revealed what Margaret had been avoiding for months. The 30-day foster period had expired in December. Legally, practically, emotionally, Ashford was already hers. All that remained was the paperwork to make the situation official, and the courage to admit that temporary had become permanent without her conscious decision. "What do you think?" she asked him now, watching him investigate a butterfly that had landed on the screen. "Ready to make this official?" Ashford's response was to abandon the butterfly in favor of his food bowl, which he approached with the expectant confidence of a cat who'd never doubted his place in the household hierarchy. Margaret laughed, a sound that came more easily now than it had 6 months earlier. "I'll take that as a yes." The morning brought a text from Callum. "Got into UJ starting in August. Can I put you down as a character reference for my summer job application?" Margaret typed her response quickly. Congratulations, of course. What's the job? Pet supply store at the mall. Figured you'd taught me enough about cats to be useful. The exchange felt like receiving dividends on an investment she hadn't realized she'd made. Callum had grown from a nervous teenager doing community service into a confident young man preparing for college, and somehow Margaret's guidance had been part of that transformation. The recognition filled her with the same satisfaction she'd felt during her best teaching years, when former students would write to tell her about scholarships or career achievements, or simply to thank her for believing in them when they hadn't yet learned to believe in themselves. At noon, her phone rang with a call she'd been half expecting for weeks. Someone from the animal rescue with a special request. Margaret, this is Sue from Coastal Animal Rescue. I hope I'm not bothering you, but we have an unusual situation. A family in Charleston had to evacuate due to flooding, and they're staying in temporary housing that doesn't allow pets. They have a senior cat, 12 years old, very gentle, but he needs a foster home for at least 3 months while they find permanent housing. I know you've been incredibly helpful with donations, and I wondered if you might consider. Margaret's first impulse was to say no. Ashford had finally settled into their routine, had claimed his territories throughout the house with the methodical precision cats bring to establishing their domains. Introducing another cat, especially an older one stressed by displacement and loss, could disrupt the careful equilibrium they'd built together. But something in Sue's voice, the particular exhaustion that came from making impossible calls about impossible situations, reminded Margaret of her own circumstances 6 months earlier. Someone had taken a chance on her ability to care for a displaced cat, and that decision had changed both their lives in ways she was still discovering. "Tell me more about him," she heard herself say. "His name is Winston. Grey and white, very calm temperament. He's been with the same family his whole life, but the husband lost his job, and they're living in a FEMA trailer while they wait for insurance settlements. The wife called us crying, saying she'd rather find him a loving foster home than surrender him to a shelter where he might not get adopted because of his age." Margaret looked across the kitchen to where Ashford was conducting his afternoon grooming routine, one leg extended at an impossible angle, completely absorbed in the important business of maintaining his dignity. "Would I need to bring him here first? Let them meet. That would be ideal. Senior cats usually adapt better to established territories if they can meet the resident cat on neutral ground first." "Okay," Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Let's try it." 3 hours later, she was driving to the animal hospital with Ashford in his carrier, both of them prepared to meet Winston and determine whether their household could expand to accommodate one more refugee from circumstances beyond his control. Winston turned out to be a distinguished gentleman of a cat, grey and white with the kind of patient dignity that comes from years of being loved and cared for by people who understood his value. He greeted Ashford through the mesh of his carrier with polite interest rather than fear or aggression, and Ashford responded with the cautious acceptance he reserved for creatures who seemed to understand proper social protocols. "They're handling this well," Dr. Chen observed, watching the two cats assess each other with careful courtesy. "Winston's clearly been well socialized, and Ashford has excellent judgment about other animals." The trial introduction in the hospital's neutral territory went smoothly enough that Margaret agreed to a 2-week trial foster placement, with the understanding that if the cats couldn't coexist peacefully, Winston would return to the rescue for placement with a different family. Driving home with 2 cats, Margaret felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and anticipation that had become the signature emotion of her new life, the recognition that she was choosing challenges that would stretch her abilities and change her circumstances in ways she couldn't predict or control. At home, she set up Winston's temporary quarters in the guest bedroom, complete with his own food and water bowls, litter box and sleeping area, following the integration protocols she'd researched online. Ashford supervised the process with the focused attention of a landlord reviewing lease agreements, occasionally approaching Winston's carrier to conduct olfactory investigations that seemed to meet with his approval. The first week required careful management, scheduled feeding times in separate rooms, supervised interactions in common areas, gradual expansion of Winston's access to shared territories as both cats demonstrated their ability to coexist without conflict. Margaret found herself running a diplomatic mission between 2 sovereign nations, negotiating treaties over windowsill access and mediating disputes about who had priority for the sunny spot on the living room carpet. But by the second week, something remarkable had happened. Winston's presence had activated a caretaking instinct in Ashford that Margaret hadn't previously observed. The younger cat began sharing his favorite sleeping spots, leading Winston to the windows with the best views of bird activity, and even engaging in the kind of mutual grooming that signaled acceptance into the family structure. "I think they've worked it out," Margaret told Sue during the check-in call. "Winston seems to understand that this is Ashford's territory, and Ashford seems to enjoy having company that appreciates his superior knowledge of household routines. Are you willing to extend the foster period? The family's housing situation is more complicated than we initially thought. It might be 6 months before they can take him back." Margaret looked across the living room to where both cats were conducting their evening grooming rituals side by side, Ashford occasionally pausing to clean a spot on Winston's head that the older cat couldn't reach comfortably. "6 months is fine," she said, "but I think you should start preparing the family for the possibility that Winston might decide he likes it here." The conversation felt like another step in a journey she hadn't planned, but could no longer imagine abandoning. Her house was becoming a refuge for creatures who needed temporary safety while they waited for their circumstances to stabilize. More than that, it was becoming the kind of place where love was defined not by permanence, but by the quality of care offered during whatever time was available. Spring moved towards summer, with the lazy inevitability of southern seasons bringing longer evenings and the kind of heat that made air conditioning necessary rather than optional. Margaret's reading group had grown to include 12 regular members, and their monthly meetings had evolved into social gatherings that extended beyond literary discussion into genuine friendship among people who'd discovered they had more in common than geographical proximity and similar taste in books. Callum graduated from high school with honors and started his summer job at the pet supply store, where his knowledge of cat behavior, gained through months of observing Ashford, made him valuable to customers struggling with their own pet-related challenges. He stopped by regularly to report on his progress and seek advice about college preparation, treating Margaret as the kind of trusted adult advisor she'd always been to her best students, but had never expected to be again after retirement. Miriam's Sunday visits had evolved into a routine that felt as natural as family traditions, except better, because it was chosen rather than inherited. They cooked together, shared books and opinions, and provided each other with the kind of comfortable companionship that required neither constant entertainment nor careful conversation about neutral topics. The network of people Margaret had assembled for animal rescue donations had grown into something resembling an extended community, connected by shared concern for creatures who couldn't advocate for themselves. She found herself coordinating with churches and schools and neighborhood associations, managing supply drives and fundraising events with the same organizational skills she'd once applied to curriculum development and parent-teacher conferences. But it was the quiet moments that felt most significant. Early mornings when both cats positioned themselves in patches of sunlight while she drank her coffee and planned the day ahead. Evening hours when they all settled into their preferred spots for reading and napping, and the kind of peaceful coexistence that didn't require words or explanations. On a humid evening in June, Margaret received a call from Winston's family with news she'd been half expecting for weeks. "We found a place," the woman said, her voice carrying relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "A rental house that allows pets, and my husband got a job offer that starts next month. We can take Winston back." Margaret felt a complex mixture of happiness for their good fortune and reluctance to disrupt the harmony that had developed in her household. "That's wonderful news. When do you need him?" "Well, that's the thing. We drove down to see him last week, remember? And he seemed so settled, so content. The way he and your cat had bonded. We talked about it, and we wondered if you might consider keeping him permanently. We know he's happy with you, and our new situation is still pretty unstable. We'd rather know he's in a place where he's truly at home than bring him back into uncertainty." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, working through practical details and emotional concerns, but Margaret's decision had been made the moment she watched Ashford groom Winston's ears the previous evening with the patient attention older siblings reserve for family members they've decided to protect. "I'd be honored to keep him," she said finally. "He's become part of our household in ways I didn't expect." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her living room surrounded by evidence of the life she'd built without quite realizing she was building it. Donation boxes waiting for pickup, library books for next month's reading group discussion, a calendar filled with appointments and commitments and social obligations she'd chosen rather than inherited. Both cats were asleep in their preferred evening spots. Ashford stretched across the back of the sofa like a grey scarf. Winston curled in the armchair that had become his personal throne, and the house felt exactly the right size for the life being lived within its walls. 6 months ago, Margaret had been a woman living alone in a house too big for her circumstances, managing her days around the basic requirements of survival and the careful maintenance of dignity in the face of loss. Tonight, she was someone whose presence mattered to creatures who depended on her care, whose knowledge and experience had value to young people preparing for their own challenges, whose friendship had become important to neighbors who discovered the difference between proximity and community. The transformation hadn't happened all at once, and it hadn't happened without cost. Opening her door to Ashford that first stormy night had required her to open other doors she'd been keeping locked, to vulnerability, to responsibility, to the possibility that caring for something fragile might be worth the risk of eventual loss. But sitting in her living room on a summer evening, listening to the comfortable sounds of 2 cats who trusted her completely and a neighborhood settling into peaceful night routines, Margaret understood that some doors are meant to be opened not once but repeatedly, each time revealing new possibilities for connection and meaning, and the kind of love that doesn't replace what was lost, but creates something entirely new and unexpectedly beautiful. Outside, the savannah evening settled into its familiar rhythms of distant traffic and crickets, and the occasional train whistle from the port. Inside, Margaret Sullivan was no longer alone, no longer waiting for her life to resume, no longer managing days around the simple goal of getting through them intact. She was home, surrounded by creatures who needed her, and people who valued her, and purposes that gave shape to her days and meaning to her choices. The circle that had begun with a cat appearing on her doorstep in the middle of a storm had expanded to include more cats, more people, more reasons to wake up each morning with anticipation rather than resignation. It was, she realized, exactly the life she would have chosen if she'd been brave enough to imagine it 6 months earlier. But sometimes the best gifts are the ones we don't know we need until they arrive unannounced on our doorsteps, demanding nothing more than the courage to open the door and say, "Come in, let's see what happens next." Ashford lifted his head, caught her watching him, and offered one of his slow, deliberate blinks before settling back into sleep. In the language of cats and humans who'd learned to understand each other, it was the perfect ending to another ordinary, extraordinary day in the life they'd built together. The house was quiet now, but it was the rich quiet of spaces filled with love and purpose, and the promise of tomorrow's small adventures. For the first time in years, Margaret Sullivan was exactly where she belonged,